2 Samuel chapter number 23. I'm going to read one verse to start off with. That'd be verse number 20. And the Bible says, "And Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, the son of a valiant man of Kabzeel, who had done many acts, he slew two lion-like men of Moab. He went down also and slew a lion in the midst of a pit in a time of snow." We'll stop there for the time being. Okay, now, Benaiah, one of David's mighty men. You can find 37 names given in reference to David's mighty men. There was the first group of three. David's the most bad. Okay, the Bible calls them the most honorable of all of them. And Dad preached on them not too long ago. Okay, those three men, top echelon. Okay, top three. Then there were three underneath of them. Okay, they were known as the second three. In fact, if you can look down at verse number 23, it says, "He was more honorable than the 30. Okay, so we've got the 30. People often say, you know, David's 30 mighty men of valor. Well, there was more than 30. There was the first 30. Then there was the group of three that Benaiah was in. It says, "But he attained not to the first three." So in order to have first three, got to have a second three. Okay? And then Uriah the Hittite, he was dead at the point where this was recorded. You include him, that's 37. Okay? So David, across the course of his life, had 37 mighty men of valor that were named as these guys. They mighty, but they're also men of valor. Okay? Verse number 20. Again, it says, "Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, the son of a valiant man." Okay, Benaiah was raised right. His dad was valiant. Amen. That word valiant, amen, when you define it out, means a man of valor, strength, might, efficiency, or a man of the army. Okay? Benaiah's dad knew how to fight, but he knew how to defend. Okay, it said efficiency. I mean, you can go out in the war, tire yourself out, you're not going to last too long. Then there are those that know how to fight efficiently. Okay, there are those that know how to stand. If you don't have the right stance, anything can knock you over. But if you've got a proper stance, if you keep your footing, very hard to knock you over. Okay, there are men that know how to use the shield, and then there are guys that just stand behind it and hope that it, protects them. Okay. Benaiah's dad, Jehoiada, he was a valiant man. He had proved himself, but he passed it on to his son as well. Okay, he said, "You do these things also." They worked for me, trust me. Okay, don't try anything else. This has been tried, it's been tested, it's been proved. Okay, do you not remember in the Bible where it says, "None say, restore. None say, return to the old paths. Let us walk therein." Benaiah just walked in the old paths. He said, "I know this is going to work. My dad was a valiant man. He proved it. He passed it on to me." But Benaiah's dad, Jehoiada, his name means Jehovah knows. Now, back in Bible days, they would name people based off of the way that they lived. If your name didn't match your character and who you were by the time you were 40, they would change it to match your character. Okay, so the name that you were born with that mom and dad gave you, they may have said, "Well, I hope he turns out this way." But by the time they were 40, they would change it to describe you. Okay, it wasn't just an identifying feature to separate you from other people. It was also a definition of you summed up in a name. Benaiah's dad means God knows. Benaiah was raised, his father being a valiant man, taught him, God knows all. You don't need to know everything because God knows everything. He's saying if you serve the God that knows all, you don't need to know all. You just need to know what he wants you to do. Okay, then Benaiah's name, if you define that out, means Jehovah has built up or has built. Okay, well that may not mean anything to you, but if we were all honest, God built all of us up. We started out at nothing. But in order for his name to really mean something to you, you got to find out where he was from. It tells us. It says, "The son of a valiant man of Kabzeel." Kabzeel, town in Judah. I'm not kidding you. When I looked it up, the definition was the most remote place in Judah. You could not get farther away from civilization than Kabzeel. This is out in the sticks. Okay? So here we got this boy with a funny name named Benaiah. Okay, it wasn't funny back then. But as he lived his life, people look at him, aren't you that guy from out in the middle of nowhere? Hey, you live on the edge of civilization. You're so far out, you might even not as well be, Jewish. That's how far away you live. Okay, remember what they said to Jesus? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? I can imagine them saying the same thing about this guy. Who is this guy? Where did he come from? What do they know out there? There's no way you know anything because you're so far out, people don't take the time to come and tell you anything. But his name, God has built up. They may not have thought very much of him. But God took somebody from out in the middle of nowhere, turned him into one of David's mighty men of valor. Okay, well, that may not do anything for you. But see, when God took me and decided to build me up, he reached down into a miry pit. I was way out in the middle of nowhere. I was groping in outer darkness. Had no idea what I was looking for or where to find it. And then one day the light got turned on. God said, you may be out here in the middle of nowhere right now, but I can take you and put you on a rock. The rock. Solid rock. And with that foundation, I can build you up and turn you into what I would have you to be. Benaiah, because he knew that God knows, just said whatever God wants to do, he can make me into what he wants to make me into. He was willing to learn how to fight like a valiant man, like his dad. But you could see his character in the stories that they told about him. Okay, first he slew 2 lion-like men of Moab. Now those lion-like men, they're not normal men. Okay, there was something about them that made them resemble lions. Whether ferocity, whether the fact that they were loud. Normal guys can't beat 2 lion-like men. I'm sure that Benaiah didn't want to, but when presented with me or them or the people behind me, he said, I'll take on the 2 lions. The lion-like men. Everybody else is saying, how are we going to do this? Benaiah says, I got it. He steps in for others when they cannot do what they need to. Isn't that what Christ called us to do, to take a light to a world that had no light? That we should salt the earth to preserve it so that those in darkness have time to find the light? That men should see our good deeds and not glorify us. His name said Jehovah built up. Every time somebody said Benaiah, they're saying God made that guy into a man. Every time they say, did you hear what Benaiah did? They're giving God glory for God turning him in to what God turned him into. That's what we're supposed to do. The next one, killed a lion in a pit on a snowy day. One, snow, cold, not fun. Snow in the desert, whole lot more not fun. They're not used to snow. Okay, out in the middle of hot in the Middle East, at some point he wound up where there was snow. And then he wound up in a pit. You know what a pit is? Something you can't get out of. That's why it's called a pit. Otherwise it'd be called a ravine or a valley or an indentation. Pit is hole in the ground you can't get out of. That's why it's a pit. And to make things worse, either he was in the pit first and the lion fell in, or the lion was in the pit and he got in the pit. But one way or the other, lion in a pit, neither one of them can get out. Now whether he wanted to or not, he's in the pit on a snowy day, and there's a lion, and since neither of them can get out, there's going to be a fight. There are days you don't know that a fight's coming, but God knows that a fight's coming. You don't know that it's going to snow that day, but God does. You don't know that while you're in the pit, A lion also was going to show up in the pit. But where in that did Benaiah say, well, today's just so bad, I give up? He'd been eaten. He persevered, one, because he's in a pit on a snowy day. He's surviving. He knows that God's given him the tools that he can make it through this, whatever the situation was. But then when the lion shows up, wasn't a matter of, well, I feel like fighting that lion today. It was, he had to. He endured. Endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. There are going to be days that you feel like you're in a pit on a snowy day. And then, to, icing on the cake, there's going to be a lion in there. But Benaiah just said, God knows. And he's built me up. I believe that if I stay on the foundation that he put me on, nothing can knock me off. Okay, but at least in those two situations, he had a weapon. Let's go down to the next verse. And he slew an Egyptian, a goodly man. Now that goodly man means that he was fit, he was strong. He wasn't anemic, he wasn't weak. Okay, this guy knew what he was doing with a spear. Okay, and he slew an Egyptian, a goodly man, and the Egyptian had a spear in his hand, but he went down to him with the staff and plucked the spear out of the Egyptian's hand and slew him with his own spear. Okay, now, this Egyptian, this fit man, knew what he was doing with his spear. At some point, Benaiah had to go confront this guy. How do I know that he had to and that he didn't choose to? Because he went down to fight a guy with a spear that knew what he was doing with the spear, and he had a staff. At the beginning of that day, he wasn't anticipating a fight. He had a walking stick. Whatever he was doing, whatever business he had, he was out doing it. And then at some point, this Egyptian shows up, and what's it say? And Benaiah went down to him. Wasn't in his way, it was out of his way, but he had to go do it. Again, if he didn't, maybe somebody else would pay the price. Or maybe this man, broke some law. He's standing there with a spear, resisting arrest, or maybe he's already injured people. Whatever he's doing, maybe he's issuing a challenge like Goliath did, and Benaiah just says, who is this guy that's defying the God that I serve? I know that God knows. That God built me up. Nobody talks blasphemy about my God. I don't know what the situation was. But he went down there with the staff. And using the staff, he knocked the spear out of the Egyptian's hand, who knew what he was doing. Again, he's a goodly man. He's fit. It's not because this guy's, sickly and weak, and he went down and just snatched the spear out of his hand. No, he used something that was not a weapon to get the weapon out of the hand of the Egyptian. And then he took it and killed the guy with his own spear. Okay, back in Bible days, you didn't get to carry a weapon unless you could hold on to that weapon. The only thing more dangerous than an enemy is an enemy that not only has a weapon, but your weapon too. Why give somebody something if they don't know what they're doing? Benaiah, not having a weapon, went down and took the other guy's weapon. God built him up to the point that Benaiah, being humble, knowing his strengths and weaknesses and abiding therein, he looked at that guy and he said, he may be strong, but I believe that if I go down, God's built me up. I just believe that God's taught me what I need to know to take this stick, beat the guy with the spear. David took a stone and slew Goliath. In fact, to seal the deal, he didn't even have a weapon. He had to take Goliath's own sword and cut Goliath's head off with it. And it was so heavy that he didn't pick it up and swing it. It says that he let the sword fall. Right? He just dropped the sword on Goliath. The other guy may have a weapon. The other guy may be bigger. He may be goodly. He may be fit. But God built Benaiah up. In fact, the Bible says, if God be for us, who can be against us? But if we do what we're supposed to, doesn't matter what the other guy has. All that matters is who my God is. Okay, Benaiah's whole life is a life of faith, is a life of trust, of him doing what he knows he can do, and in believing that God will do the rest. Why? Because his dad, being a valiant man, taught him, God knows. God knows. No matter what anybody tells you, God knows. Why do you think Benaiah followed David around when he was living in caves? When he was on the run from the king Saul? Because he's standing there and he's thinking to himself, God knows. That's God's man. And if God knows, God's going to build up God's man. So I'll just stick with God's man. He's saying God knows that Saul's a wicked king. God knows that David's the righteous one, a man after his own heart. He says, and if God knows that, God knows my heart, I just want to be on God's side. As Moses asked the Israelites when they started their journey into the wilderness, who is on the Lord's side? But they're saying, I am, because he's built me up. Okay, so now that we've gotten that backstory a little bit, oh my goodness, it is a miracle. Brother Lawrence is here from the jail, and it's not even 10:30 yet. Oh, wow. But anyway, that's the background. So look down, if you will, in verse number 23. This is going to be the lesson. He, talking about Benaiah, was more honorable than 30, but he attained not to the first 3, and David set him over his guard. Okay, now, that guard, if I can remember how to say it correctly, were the Cherethites and the Pelethites. Okay, those were 2 groups that were David's bodyguards. They were protectors of the king. They didn't go out and fight with the rest of the army. They had one job: protect the king. Only job. Benaiah, as captain of David's guard, it was his job to stand right next to the king. Everywhere the king went, unless the king said, wait here, to get to the king, you had to go through Benaiah. Now, how much trust did David have to sit this man right next to him? Okay, now remember, his dad's name, God knows. Because God knows, I'll trust God. His name, God is built up. God's made me into who I am. But none of that matters if the king doesn't trust you. You know how much somebody has to trust you to say, my life is in your hands. Now, David didn't literally think that. David thought, my life's in God's hands. But God's given me this guy that knows that God knows. God's built him up. And I trust him because he's been there with me in the hard times. And I've seen that he's got faith and trust in God. And he says, because I can trust him, because I know that God trusts him, I'm going to sit him by my side. But this guy had one job. I can take you and I can show you Joab, the son of Zeruiah. That was David's sister. Okay, this is David's nephew. He was the one that was in charge of the army. So he was captain of the host. I can take you and show you that other men had command over the 30 mighty men of valor. I can take you and show you in David's days who the princes were of all the different providences. Each one of those people had a specific job. Now, as captain of the army, you've got a bunch of different jobs you got to do. Benaiah had one job: protect the king. Whatever the king says, I'll do. If I can't go with the king, I am responsible to pick the men that will protect the king. If the king tells me to send somebody to go and do a job, I've got to pick somebody that would do the job just as well as I could. Because Benaiah's not, if king could tell Benaiah to run through a brick wall, he'd either do it or die trying. How do you know? Because he fought a lion in a pit on a snowy day. Most people would have given up. He faced 2 lion-like men, not 1, 2. When everybody else is like, we can't do it, he says, I got it. Because God's got it. Amen. He faced an Egyptian with no weapon and went down to him. It was out of his way. But he said, this is the right thing to do. And he plucked the spear out of the Egyptian's hand and said, thanks for the weapon, and then slew him with it. He's not going to stop because he knows that God's in control. And if God wants him to do it, he's going to do it. So if God's man, the king, who's been anointed, says, go do this, Benaiah's not going to stop. So if he can't go and the king says, send someone, he's got to find someone that's going to do it the way that he would do it. It's going to do it exactly as he would have done, because he's responsible for the job getting done. He wants to make sure it's done right. Got one job. Stand right next to the king and protect the king. Do whatever the king says. One job. You know how many soldiers David had? We know that he had mighty men. He had all the soldiers in Israel. He's king. There were some that weren't even Israelites that served him, because along the way they saw, this guy knows who God is. And they followed him. David fought for a while in the camp of the Philistines. God made for him a haven in the midst of the enemy, and even worked it out to where he didn't have to fight the Israelites ever against them. But when he was with those Philistines, there's a lot of people that weren't Israelites that said, this guy, he knows who God is. All the while, Benaiah's just standing next to him. So when David's sitting on the throne, he says, Benaiah, I want you protecting me. I know nothing's getting through you unless God ordained it. He says the only way somebody's going to get through you is if God allows it. Why? Because God built Benaiah up. He's saying in order for you to be torn down, God's got to okay it. So I'm going to sit you in front of me because you're a strong wall that God's built up. And I'm going to stand behind it. Benaiah never issued orders. In fact, we're going to take you and show you some things in his life. But David even served all the way through to Solomon. Benaiah just lived for God and did as the king said. When I look at Benaiah, I don't see a guy who threw a lion in a pit on a snowy day. I don't see a guy who killed 2 lion-like men of Moab. I don't see a guy who went down to an Egyptian, a goodly man, and plucked a spear out of his hand with the staff and then killed him with his own spear. I see a guy from out in the middle of nowhere, on the far edge of civilization, that God said, I can make something out of you. Your dad was a valiant man. He was an honorable man. You'll be more honorable because I'll build you up to be it. But then, when Benaiah gets to it, he could have desired anything. He could have had anything. What did Benaiah want? He said, I want to stand next to the king. He didn't want a position of the first 3. He didn't want to be one of the 30 mighty men of valor. He just said, I'll be whatever the king wants. And when the king said, will you protect? He said, I'll do it. I'll be your bodyguard. I look at Benaiah and I say, I just want to be next to the king. I don't need to be out in the field. I'm satisfied right here, next to the king. So that's what we're going to teach on. Put me next to the king. Who's the king? The Lord. Doesn't matter what everybody else is doing for the Lord. I just want to be as close as I can to God. Amen. That's what Benaiah did. Did Benaiah long for battle? Maybe. Did he long to have people cheer his name? No. Why? Because if he wanted people cheering his name, he never would have been in a cave with David. Never would have been counted as a fugitive for being associated with God's man. There were people that wanted to kill Benaiah just because he followed David. And then, later on, when people conspired against David, Benaiah, always right there next to the king. Didn't matter who was against him, didn't matter what it looked like. He'd already slew an Egyptian with his own spear when he had no weapon. He'd been in the pit on a snowy day. He knows that God knows and that God can take care of it. Never a question. You don't get to stand next to the king unless you're grounded, unless you've got a sure foundation. Jesus is the rock, but he may not be your foundation. There's a difference. He set me on the solid rock, but I had to choose to make that rock my foundation. God can't build up unless we allow him to settle us, to put down the foundation. You can't build a house just starting on a rock. Okay, in order to make it your foundation, you've got to hollow out a place that's level. Doesn't the Bible say that there is a cleft in the rock. There's a spot just for me that God said, this is Jordan's foundation. But unless I get to that point to where God can build me up on that foundation, it's not going to be sure. God does all things well. He's not going to waste his time on building up a foundation till I get to that spot in the rock that's just for me. Can't build up a spot for me on Brother Lawrence's plot. That's his spot. I can take you through and look at the other 36 mighty men of valor. Each one of them had their spot. Benaiah's was right next to the king. He said, God, build me up here. You chose this spot for me. I'll do it to the best of my ability. Just build me up right here. Didn't want somebody else's spot. He wanted to be right next to the king. Now the other men, they knew that the king liked them, that he trusted them, that they were his friends. They loved the king so much that they would willingly lay down their life to save the king. But none of them got to be as close to the king as Benaiah. Every day, right next to him. The king may have been behind, but he may not always have been able to see the king, but he knew the king was close by. He always had to be close enough that if the king said, hey, Benaiah would be there to hear it and then to say, yeah, king. Always had to be within the earshot. If he wasn't, he had to have men around the king that he knew he could trust, that if they were within earshot, that they would be able to defend the king. He trained those two groups, the Cherethites and the Pelethites. He trained them to be able to do what he could do. He's saying, I may have to go away from the king. I can't be on guard 24 hours a day all the time. But I can train you up to when I'm not around, you can do what I would do for the king. Benaiah wasn't just interested in as close as he could get to the king. He's trying to get other people close to the king, but also to where they were equipped to be there. Amen. You don't get to stand next to the king unless you know what you're doing. You've got responsibilities when you're next to the king. You've got expectations next to the king. You can't be one of those guys that nods off during the day when he's standing at attention. Because at any moment, something could come for the king. But I've got to be in between that and the king. Yes. Now, God doesn't need us between him and anything. Most of the time, God goes before us. Yeah. Amen. But in order to get as close as I can to God, I've got a desire to train others, to equip them. Just like Benaiah's dad equipped him. His dad was a valiant man. He was a valiant man. It says that Benaiah was more honorable than the 30. This is one of the most honorable men in the entire kingdom. And he's looking at others and he's saying, if you want to get close to the king, I can teach you to be honorable. I can teach you to be valiant. I can teach you how to put the armor on. I can teach you how to go. And he's saying, you don't believe me? I'm a boy from out in the middle of nowhere. God turned me into what I could be. God can turn you into what you need to be. Amen. He said, in order to get close to the king, you've got to be what God wants you to be. Can't fight it. But then he's saying, when you're there, this is how you act. This is how you stand. This is how you do what it is the king wants you to do. He says, you got to know your job. There may be 10 or 12 soldiers around the king. He's saying, you've got this job. You've got this area. You've got that area. You're scanning people at the door. You don't let anybody with a weapon come close to the king. He's training them to do their job. Why? He knows he's going to die one day. If he doesn't go by the sword, he's going to go through the grave. And he's saying, when I'm gone, there needs to be somebody that knows how to protect the king. Not only that, okay, we've seen Benaiah's strength. We've seen his interest in others. We've seen how God has built him up. We've seen how he just says, I want to get as close to the king as possible. But I want you to notice Benaiah's loyalty. Okay? Go with me, if you will, to 1 Kings, chapter number 1 is where we're going to start. And then we're going to go over to chapter number 4, I believe it is. Okay, but give you a little bit of backstory. 1 Kings, chapter number 1, verse number 5, one of David's sons, his name is Adonijah. Okay? He exalted himself and said, I'm going to be the next king over Israel. He says, I think David's old. David's getting ready to die. Okay, he's not long for this earth, and he says, I'm going to be the next king. And then he gets some men on his side. He prepares chariots and horses. He's got 50 men that are going to go before him and proclaim to the nation of Israel that Adonijah is going to be the next king. Okay, then it says, and he conferred with Joab, the son of Zeruiah. This is David's nephew, remember. Okay, this is the guy that's in charge of the army. He's saying, if I can get him on my side, doesn't matter what everybody else thinks, I've got the army on my side. Okay, and with Abiathar, the priest. That's the high priest. He's saying, if the priest is on my side, and if the army's on my side, surely God's on my side. Nope, but anyway. And they, following Adonijah, helped him. Okay, notice who they didn't call in verse number 8. But Zadok the priest, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and Nathan the prophet, and Shimei, and Rei, and the mighty men which belonged to David were not with Adonijah. Okay, then in verse number 10, but Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah, and the mighty men, and Solomon his brother, he called not. He's saying, we're going to try and steal the throne away from whoever David wants to give it to. And we're going to call the army, we're going to call the high priest, we're going to get everybody that we can. He says, we're headed up over here, we're going to slay sheep and oxen, we're going to make sacrifices to God, we're going to put on a party and let everybody know that I'm going to be king. But he says, but do not invite Benaiah. Don't invite him. He's too loyal to David. He'll never go against what the king wants. He says, and Zadok the priest, he's on the king's side. He says, oh, and by the way, Solomon, don't invite him either. David told him he was going to be the next king. He says, if he shows up, that means Benaiah is going to show up. And Benaiah is not going to let anybody be king except who David says is going to be king. He was so loyal that other people knew, you can't tempt him. You can't buy him. You can't corrupt him. He's been as close to the king as long as the king has been king.
Yeah. Amen.
He says, as anybody else. He's saying, if we're going to take this, I've got the army, they can have Benaiah. Everybody else is going to think, too devout, too close. He might be a fanatic, right? He just shouts too much. He sings too much. He praises too much. They cry too much. They pray too much. I don't want them. You can have them because I've got everybody else. Well, let me show you what God can do with a guy that he took from the middle of nowhere and build up. Okay? Still in chapter number 1 of 1 Kings, go down to verse number 32. Okay, David hears about everything that's going on. He says, and King David said, call me Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada. And they came before the king. And the king also said unto them, take with you the servants of your Lord, and call Solomon my son to ride upon my own mule, and bring him down to Gahan, and let Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him there king over Israel, and blow ye with the trumpet, and say, God save King Solomon. Then ye shall come up after him, that he may come and sit upon my throne, for he shall be king in my stead, and I have appointed him to be ruler over Israel and over Judah. King's got a plan. He says, we're not going to wait till I'm dead. Solomon will be king in my stead. He says, while I yet live, I'm going to make Solomon king. Make sure everybody knows. He says, you guys are going to go down, put him on my mule, take him down to Gahan, anoint him there, and then bring him back up, blowing the trumpets and saying, God save King Solomon. Now, nowhere in that plan do you find anything for Benaiah to do. The priests are going to anoint him. Benaiah doesn't need to play a trumpet. They got trumpet players. They've got horns. They got people that might be able to shout louder than him that can say, God save King Solomon. Why did David send Benaiah? For the same reason that the other crowd didn't want Benaiah around. He says, if they see Benaiah with Solomon, they'll know that's who I picked. He says, if they see him with the priest that everybody knows follows after God, and with the prophet that speaks for God, but if they see him with the one that's closest to the king, they'll know that Solomon's real. Amen. That he's the real king. Amen. Benaiah was the protector of the throne of David. Solomon couldn't have sat on the throne unless he got through Benaiah. Benaiah had to let him. Solomon's still a lad at this point. He's not grown. That's why he asked God for wisdom, because he's saying, I don't know. Maybe Benaiah said, hey, I do know who knows, because God knows. That was my dad's name. Let me tell you about everything that God knows. But Solomon had to get through Benaiah. So if Solomon's sitting on the throne, they know the king allowed it. He was so loyal to David that they said, Benaiah's with Solomon. If Benaiah's with Solomon, that's the one that God picked. Shouldn't be an issue. World shouldn't have to ask what's right or what's wrong. They should be able to just see from how Christians live. But people didn't live for so long. Things have become so far away from God that people don't know what it is. If some people just said, I'm going to get as close to God as I can get, and whatever they see us do, they know that's the will of God. Because some may not be as close to God. Some may not be as scripturally sound. But if they follow after the new king, okay, not the king of this world, but the king, the one that's eventually going to sit on the throne of David. Y'all know that when Jesus comes back as Messiah, that's what he's going to do. But anyway. They say, why are you following after him? I know that you follow after God. Why are you following this? Why are you doing that? I want to come too. Well, all right. Let me teach you why I do this. Let me show you in the Bible where it says to do this or not to do that. When they saw Benaiah, they knew what Benaiah knew. They knew what he believed. And if they saw him following after him, they said, that honorable man's following after the real king. But look at what Benaiah says. Benaiah also very spiritual. How do you know? Because of what he says in verse number 36. And Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, answered the king and said, Amen. Hey, let's go do it. Amen means so be it. He's saying, good plan, king. But then he says, the Lord God of my Lord, the king, say so too. He's saying, you know what, king? God's on the side of that plan. He's saying that's a good plan, but I like it even better because God likes the plan.
Yes. Amen.
How did Benaiah know what God wanted? Because he's close to God too.
Amen.
He's saying, you know what, David, that's a good idea. I like it even better because God likes it. He says that'd be a good plan on its own, but if God in the plan, no way that plan can fail. God built this man up. He knew that God built him up. And he said, I'm just going to stay close to God. But look at verse number 37. He says, as the Lord hath been with my Lord the king, even so be he with Solomon, and make his throne greater than the throne of my Lord King David. He's saying, God likes the plan so much, he's going to make Solomon greater than you ever were. He says, I like this plan because God likes Solomon. He says, because God likes Solomon, I'm on Solomon's side. You know what Benaiah's job was after David wasn't king? He was still the bodyguard for King Solomon. Why? Because it didn't matter who was on the throne. All that mattered was who God wanted to be in control. He said, whoever's on God's side, that's whose side I'm on. If God's on your side, I'm on your side.
Yes.
Okay, but last thing, if you were to go over to chapter number 2, I believe it is, we could go and see that Benaiah had to do some business that he may not have liked. Okay, Solomon becomes king, and there are people that they have to deal with. Solomon's own cousin, the son of David's sister, took the army and rebelled against David. Said, we want Adonijah to be king. Okay, after that, they ran for a while. Before that, Joab, unbeknownst to David, killed the captain of the Israelite host and the captain of the host of Judah and took their positions, made himself host over the army. David didn't find out about it, but then he also swore that, nothing bad would come to him while David was alive. David charges Solomon and says, hey, there's some business you got to take care of. You may not like it. It's going to be hard, but it's what needs to be done. And Solomon the king, when he had to do these things, not just Joab, but also Adonijah, at one point, Solomon sends Benaiah to him. Where's this guy end up at? He holds on to the horns of the altar. He says, I'm not letting go of the altar of God until the king promises that he'll spare me. Benaiah comes back, tells the king, he says, go and get him. Tell him if he changes, that I don't have a problem with him. Okay, first bit of business was he got a brother back. That's his brother. Tried to take the throne. But Benaiah was able to take the news. Hey, there is hope. There is a way. We'll be able to reach some if we just do what the king says. But then there were some that wouldn't move. Benaiah had to become an executioner. Solomon said, I don't want to do this. That's my cousin. That's Joab. He's captain of the armies. He followed after David for a while. He did some wrong. And then that little bit of wrong turned into a lot of wrong. And he's saying, and the innocent blood that Joab spilled now will be upon the head of Joab. And he's saying, God's going to take care of this. He says, we're going to get this guy, this black spot, off of the record of my family, of my line, of our honorability. He's tainting it. He says he's got to go. There's another one. David said, this man is, done evilly. Can't let him go. Who was that? That was the high priest that also sided with Adonijah. Zadok, you find, becomes the high priest after that. Who did Solomon send to do the hard job? Benaiah. Who did Solomon send to do the job that he knew it had to be done? Benaiah may not have liked it. He's the captain of the king's bodyguard. Surely he knows the captain of the army. They've talked, okay? They know each other. And he's saying, I've got to go kill Joab today. Joab's hiding in the tabernacle, and he says, you want to kill me? Kill me here. I'm not leaving. He thinks he's got immunity. Solomon says, go kill him in the temple. He says, and bury him. Get this thing settled with. Benaiah went and did it. He's doing things that most people, when push comes to shove, when rubber meets the road, they're going to say, I don't know if I can do that. That's going to be hard. I may get hurt. Other people may not like what I'm about ready to do. Benaiah just said, I'm so close to God, I don't want anything else to come between me and God. I'm so close to the king, I don't want somebody else to take my spot. God picked that spot for me. I'm going to stay next to the king. I'm going to stay next to God's man. I'm going to stay next to God's people. I'm going to stay next to what God wants me to do because God's built me up, because God knows. God knew before he built me up that I'd have to do this. And he's built me up so that I can do this and not fall over. I won't topple with the weight or the pressure or the wind or the waves. He's saying I can do this. And I will do it. Not because I want to do it, not because I'm going to enjoy it, but because it's what needs to be done. And then afterwards you find, because Benaiah just stood next to the king all those years, faithful to the king all those years, when Israel needed a new captain of the host, who did Solomon pick? Benaiah. He's saying, Benaiah, I still want you as my bodyguard, but I also want you to command the armies. He's saying, you don't have to go any farther away from me. You're still my bodyguard. You're right here next to me. But I'm also going to give you the command of all the armies. Why? Because he knew he could trust them. Just like the enemies of David knew, don't call Benaiah. Don't let him know. He'll ruin everything.
Amen.
That's that lion in a pit on the snowy day. Benaiah just believed in God. That's those two lion-like men of Moab. He knew who had built him up and he trusted in him. But when he stood next to the king, that's all he wanted, to be next to the king. Why? Because that's where God wanted him to be. If I get as close to God as I possibly can get, I can be a spiritual Benaiah. But in order to do it, God's going to have to build me up, not me building myself up. And then once he builds me up, I've just got a purpose in myself to be what God wants me to be. A stone cannot be a cup of water, and a cup of water can't be a blade of grass. Benaiah just was Benaiah. He was who God had built him up to be. He knew that. And he just was who God wanted him to be. And because he was, God exalted him greatly. He was everything that he needed to be for God because he chose God above everybody else.